Good evening, friends. In tonight's story, we step into the cold stone corridors of power, cloaked in incense and silence, where faith was law, and fear walked hand in hand with devotion. We will journey into the darkest hours of one of the most terrifying chapters in history, the Inquisition. Across centuries and continents, the Inquisition hunted not armies, but ideas. It whispered through cathedral halls, knocked at doors in the dead of night, and unwrapped the quiet thoughts people tried to hide, even from themselves. It was not only a tribunal, it was a way of seeing the world, of rooting out doubt and punishing it. Tonight, we will try to imagine what it was like to survive a single night under its gaze, not as a noble or a soldier, but as an ordinary soul, accused and unsure, with candlelight flickering outside your prison wall, and the air heavy with prayers and suspicion. The world we're about to enter is one of secrecy, torture, ritual, and righteousness, where even the innocent feared the silence of their own homes. This is not just the story of the Inquisition, it's the story of what happens when belief turns into a blade. Before we begin, support my work by liking the video and subscribing if you enjoy it. And let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always makes me smile to see people from all over the world listening, resting, drifting off to these stories. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let us begin our descent into the darkest hour of the past, when the candles burned low and no one dared speak aloud. Now we will look at how the Inquisition began, in the smoky courts of Spain, where heresy was hunted like a shadow in candlelight, and faith became the sharpest tool of control. The year is 1478. The streets of Castile whisper with a nervous energy. Spain is newly unified under the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and their vision is one of holy purity. The Reconquista is ending. The Moors have been pushed back. The last of the Islamic kingdoms in Iberia teeter on the edge of surrender. Spain is to become one Christian body, one faith, one crown, one God. But in that dream of unity lies its most brutal contradiction, because many who live within the kingdom's walls do not worship in churches. Some kneel toward Mecca, others light Sabbath candles in secret. Still others, once devout Catholics, begin to question what they're told. And to a fearful monarch, doubt is more dangerous than rebellion. So the crown turns inward, not toward foreign enemies, but toward the hearts of its own people. The Spanish Inquisition is born not from the church directly, but from the royal court. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, which had targeted Cathars and Waldensians in France under papal authority, this one would be controlled by the Spanish state. The Pope, wary but obliging, grants them permission. Their goal on paper is to root out heresy, but in practice, it becomes a machine of surveillance, fear, and religious conformity. The earliest targets are convertos, Jews who had converted to Christianity under pressure or to avoid exile. Though baptized, they are still watched. Are they truly Christians? Or do they whisper prayers in Hebrew behind closed doors? Suspicions multiply, inquisitors are dispatched, lists are drawn, confessions, even whispered ones, are recorded. People begin to vanish in the night. Life in Spain changes. Entire cities grow quiet. Markets lose their laughter. Taverns turn cautious. Even churches, once filled with joyful song, begin to echo with fear. Because anyone can be accused. Merchant who closes his shop early on Friday? A woman who lights candles too precisely? A man who avoids pork at a feast? Neighbors begin to watch each other. Whispers spread like wildfire. And the Inquisition doesn't need proof, only suspicion. Others arrive not with armies, but with parchment and quills. They set up tribunals in cities across Spain, Seville, Córdoba, Toledo. Each tribunal has a panel, a group of clerics and legal experts who examine cases and issue verdicts. The process is cold, methodical, and opaque. First, they issue an edict of grace. This is a public notice nailed to doors, read aloud in churches, offering people a chance to confess voluntarily. For 30 days, anyone who believes they may have sinned can come forward. Confession might lessen the penalty. But the edict has a darker side. It also requires you to report others. If you know a neighbor, a relative, a friend who holds unorthodox beliefs, and you don't report them, you are guilty too. This is how the web is spun. Families begin to fall apart, children denounce parents, spouses whisper into the ears of inquisitors, rivalries once petty become deadly. No one feels safe. Man in Toledo is dragged from his home for owning a Hebrew prayer book hidden beneath his floorboards, a gift from his grandmother. He insists he is a loyal Catholic. But the tribunal believes otherwise. Another man is questioned for refusing to eat meat on Wednesdays. Perhaps he holds to old customs. Another is turned in by a jealous cousin who wishes to inherit his land. The line between sin and politics blurs. The Inquisition is not chaotic. It is incredibly organized. They keep detailed records. Each case is documented. Dates, witnesses, testimonies, confessions. These archives, many still preserved today, show a system obsessed with order and self-justification. They believe what they are doing is righteous. They believe they are saving souls. To the Inquisitor, the heretic is not just an enemy of the Church, but a soul at risk of eternal damnation. Torture, imprisonment, and execution are not vengeance, they are purification. Suspicion, this belief makes the institution all the more terrifying. Imagine the moment when you first hear they are coming to your city. The bells ring differently. Riders arrive with scrolls and seals. The bishop makes announcements in Mass. People begin to speak in hushed tones. You feel the mood change. Neighbors no longer greet each other warmly. Doors close more quickly. Curtains stay drawn. Then come the posters, the edict. You read it once, twice. Your stomach turns, because even though you've done nothing wrong, you start to wonder, did I say something careless at the feast last week? Did someone see my uncle visit from Granada? Did I cross someone without realizing it? This is the power of the Inquisition. Even innocence feels like guilt. For the Crown, the Inquisition is more than religious. It is political. The monarchy needs a united Spain. It needs land, and many accused heretics have land. It needs wealth, and many conversos are merchants, scholars, and bankers. It needs fear, and nothing spreads fear like a tribunal. By centralizing religious power under royal authority, Ferdinand and Isabella create a system that terrifies both Muslims and Jews into conversion or exile. In 1492, the same year Columbus sets sail, they issue the Alhambra Decree, expelling all unconverted Jews from Spain. Tens of thousands flee. Many more pretend to convert. The Inquisition watches them all. The man who rises to lead this new machine is Tomás de Torquemada. A Dominican friar with a fierce sense of orthodoxy, Torquemada becomes the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain. His name will echo across history as both judge and executioner. He is known for his severity, his discipline, and his belief in religious purity. Under his guidance, the Inquisition expands rapidly. It is estimated that during his tenure, over 2,000 people were burned at the stake, and tens of thousands more were imprisoned, tortured, or stripped of their property. He believes he is serving God, and so he spares no one. The fear reaches even into the clergy. Priests begin to question their own sermons. Bishops worry over ancient texts in their libraries. Monks whisper prayers in Latin, hoping their pronunciation is perfect. Because the Inquisition does not exempt its own, it is not driven by faith. It is driven by uniformity. The body of Christ must be one, and any infection, however small, must be cut out completely. Even thought itself becomes dangerous. In villages, people bury old books. They burn family heirlooms that might seem suspicious. Some destroy letters written in foreign scripts, Arabic, Hebrew, even Latin if too old. Others flee to Portugal, to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire. But not all can afford to leave, and some believe they are safe until the knock comes at night. By the end of the 15th century, the Inquisition has become a shadow government. It has its own jails, its own agents, its own laws. No one is too high or too low to be judged. Some accused are nobles, others are peasants. Some are former priests, mystics, even women who speak too freely about visions or dreams. The threshold for heresy is ever-changing. Today it is a prayer said the wrong way. Tomorrow it is a silence that lasts too long. And through it all, the people learn to be quiet and never speak their doubts, to never trust too deeply, to nod at the right words and look away at the wrong ones. Spain, once filled with rich Jewish, Islamic, and Christian intellectual traditions, begins to hollow out. Its poets grow more cautious, its scholars more rigid, its cities more suspicious. Because no one, not even the pure, can survive a night under, now we turn the candle inward, into the chamber of the mind that passed judgment, that spoke softly before cruelty, and that truly believed it was saving souls. This is the world of the Inquisitor. Not a monster, not a madman, but something far more chilling. A man of duty who saw mercy in fire and salvation in fear. When we picture the Inquisition, we often imagine shadows. Hooded figures, secret torturers, blood-stained hands. But the true face of the Inquisition was far more composed. It wore clean robes. It quoted scripture. It spoke with patience, calm, and unwavering logic. Because to the Inquisitor, what he did was not vengeance. It was service. Most inquisitors were not fanatics. They were scholars. They came from the clergy, often educated, fluent in Latin, trained in law and theology. They had read Augustine and Aquinas. They had studied canon law. They believed deeply in order, in reason, and in the clarity of the Church's authority. They were chosen for their discipline, not their rage. And that discipline made them dangerous. Let us sit now in the private study of an inquisitor. His desk is covered in parchment, beside it a crucifix, a book of hours, a list of names. He is reviewing a confession, written in the prisoner's hand, signed in shaky script. He compares it to previous testimony. He notes the inconsistencies. He does not smile. He does not sneer. He simply writes, subject to further inquiry, reticent, recommend examination under pressure. He places the paper in a folder. He closes the book of records, and he kneels to pray because he believes what he is doing is holy. He believes that the soul is eternal and that temporary pain, even torture, is justified if it saves someone from damnation. To the Inquisitor, the heretic is not merely wrong. He is sick, and sickness spreads. It spreads from books, from conversation, from sarcasm, from doubt, and so the Inquisitor becomes not a judge, but a physician of faith. He applies pain the way a doctor applies a knife to cut out infection. Of course, Inquisitors were human. Some were corrupt. Some enjoyed power. Some feared heresy because it threatened their own shaky beliefs. But many, many truly thought they were saving the world. They cried when they sentenced someone to death. They fasted after ordering torture. They begged God for forgiveness even as they signed the order. But they did not stop, because they believed the Church could not be wrong. And if it could not be wrong, then they were always right. This created a closed loop of thought. The Inquisitor did not need to ask if he was just. He had already answered it. The Pope was Christ's vicar. The Church was infallible, and he was its servant. Therefore, whatever he did in the Church's name was correct, no matter how much it hurt. This is the terrifying clarity of belief without question. It is not loud, It is not wild. It is precise, and it can justify anything. The inquisitor was trained to look for signs, a pause in testimony, a trembling hand, a phrase out of place. He read faces. He studied tones. He understood fear, not with empathy, but with purpose. And he used that understanding to press harder. When a prisoner begged, "I don't remember," he would say, "God gives memory to the innocent." When a woman wept and said, "I only repeated what I heard," he would ask, "And why did you not rebuke it if your heart was pure?" These questions were not traps. They were tests of orthodoxy, of loyalty, of clarity. To the inquisitor, hesitation meant deception. Uncertainty meant guilt. Because if your faith was true, you would speak it without fear. But inquisitors also lived with contradiction. They saw innocent people suffer. They saw confessions that made no sense. They knew the pressure of the rack, the strappado, the whip. Some were haunted by what they did. There are letters written in private where inquisitors begged God to remove doubt from their hearts. Some resigned. Some went mad. A few turned away, later denouncing what they had once defended. But most continued, because to stop would mean admitting that they had done evil in the name of good. And that was a thought too heavy to bear. Their world was tightly constructed. Every ritual had meaning. Every punishment had precedent. And if the system appeared cruel, it was only because the disease of heresy was crueler. This was the belief that let them sleep at night, and it was the belief that destroyed lives by day. The inquisitor was not alone. He worked within a machine of scribes, guards, notaries, clerks, and hired judges. Each person did their part. Each one could say, "I only recorded. I only opened the door. I only prepared the rope. I only followed orders." But the inquisitor could not. He was the mind of the machine, the voice, the will. And in his calm handwriting, in his methodical orders, in his quiet prayers before sleep, we see not madness, but something more terrifying, convinced righteousness. And so the Inquisition endured, not because it was forced, but because it believed in itself. It believed that pain led to truth, that fear led to faith, that obedience led to salvation. And when belief is that strong, it does not need fire. It only needs silence. Would you like me to begin? Module 10, The End of the Inquisition, Memory, Shadows, and the Lessons We Ignore. You said, ChatGPT said, starting Module 10, The End of the Inquisition, Memory, Shadows, and the Lessons We Ignore now, in the same immersive 2,000-word style. Please hold on. It will be ready shortly. You said, M10. ChatGPT said, here is Module 10, The End of the Inquisition, Memory, Shadows, and the Lessons We Ignore, written in your immersive storytelling style and 2,000-word depth. Now we look toward the final chapter, not of punishment, but of silence. The Inquisition did not vanish in a blaze of shame or justice. It faded slowly, behind curtains of politics, doubt, and changing winds. Yet its shadow remains, not in laws, but in memory, and in what we choose to forget. By the dawn of the 18th century, something was changing. The fire had not gone out, but it flickered. Europe, once ruled by absolutism and divine right, began to whisper new ideas. Ideas of reason, of individual conscience, of the human mind as sacred in its own right. This was the Enlightenment, and it did not come like a hammer. It came like a slow thaw. And for the Inquisition, that thaw was deadly. In Spain and Portugal, tribunals still operated. But their trials were no longer for witches or conversos. Now they targeted books, philosophers, whispers of secularism, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke. Their works were banned, smuggled, read by candlelight. And inquisitors, once feared as hunters of heretics, became censors, chasing paper instead of souls. Their power waned. By the mid-1700s, resistance to the Inquisition was no longer heresy, it was policy. Kings began to question its usefulness. Why allow a church tribunal to control trade, to arrest soldiers, to silence professors? In Portugal, the reformer Marquis of Pombal reduced its power dramatically after 1750. In Spain, royal edicts began to chip away at its authority. And in 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain, the Inquisition was formally abolished. For a brief moment, the Holy Office was no more. But like the heretics it once condemned, it returned. After Napoleon fell, the Spanish monarchy restored the Inquisition in 1814. Its final years were quieter, more political than spiritual, but it still operated. It still held trials, still burned books, still punished dissent, until 1834, when Queen Isabella II officially ended it for good. But the ending was quiet. There was no trial, no reckoning, no national confession. The archives were sealed, the records kept, and the memory dulled. In schools, the Inquisition became a footnote. In sermons, a taboo. In families, a wound left unnamed. Why? Because to remember it fully would be to ask what we allowed, what we believed, what we watched, what we whispered. And those questions are uncomfortable. So silence settled again. Yet the legacy lives. In literature, we see it from Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor to Borges's Haunted Librarians. In politics, we hear echoes when speech is censored, when dissent is punished, when fear is used to claim virtue. And in religion, we still wrestle with the line between conviction and coercion. Because the Inquisition was not about faith. It was about control of faith. And that struggle remains. The records of the Inquisition still exist. Millions of pages, stored in archives in Madrid, Lisbon, Goa, Mexico City. They detail lives ruined, families divided, names erased. But they also show resilience, of women who refused to name others, of men who held to their beliefs in silence, of communities who remembered their dead in secret. These are stories of courage as much as fear. And they matter because the Inquisition is not just history. It is a mirror. It asks us what we will do when belief is questioned, when fear rises, when law and faith blend too tightly. It asks, will we remember, or will we stay silent? This is why the Inquisition still haunts us, not because it exists, but because the impulse behind it to punish thought, to burn difference, to protect truth with violence, still exists. In many places, in many forms, and it waits. So tonight, as we close this long, heavy story, remember, it is not fire that destroys freedom. It is fear, wrapped in robes, whispered in prayer, and followed in silence. Books, thin, silent objects, leather-bound, sometimes stitched by hand, sometimes no bigger than a palm. They sat on wooden shelves, in dim rooms, behind shutters drawn against the wind. Their pages held no swords, no guns, no poisons, only ink, ideas. And yet, during the Inquisition, they were feared more than armies. Because in the eyes of the Holy Office, a book could be a heretic's whisper across time, a seed of doubt, a spark that could light minds aflame. And so books became dangerous. We now turn to a quieter battlefield of the Inquisition, one not fought in dungeons or on pyres, but in study chambers, monastic cellars, and hidden corners of noble estates, where parchment turned to contraband and learning itself became an act of risk. It began with the Index Liborum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, first published in 1559 by the Roman Inquisition under Pope Paul IV. It was a long and ever-growing list of works that were not to be read, copied, owned, or even discussed without permission. Some titles were expected, works of Protestant reformers like Martin Luther, John Calvin or Wycliffe. Others were stranger: medical treatises, mystical texts, philosophical commentaries, early scientific theories. Even books written by Catholics could be blacklisted if they questioned too freely. Erasmus of Rotterdam, a respected scholar and theologian, found his works censored after his death. Others had their books mutilated, with specific passages redacted or rewritten in acceptable terms. Possessing a forbidden book was not a small matter. In some cases it meant excommunication, in others public penance, and in the worst, trial for heresy. But even so, the books did not disappear. They went underground. Let us journey to Venice, a city of canals and trade, where ships from across Europe arrived with crates of goods, and, hidden among them, books smuggled from Protestant presses in Germany or France. In the back room of a merchant's villa, a scholar opens one such crate beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp. Wrapped in cloth is a book of astronomy written by Copernicus. It suggests that the Earth moves, a radical idea, and one banned by the Church. The scholar copies passages into a leather notebook, then hides both the original and the copy behind a false panel in the wall. This is his private library. It may hold no more than 20 volumes, but each is precious, each forbidden. Across Europe, others do the same. In Salamanca, a student of medicine keeps a treatise on Jewish healing rituals sewn into the lining of his cloak. In Paris, a widow keeps her late husband's Bible, in French, not Latin, hidden beneath the kitchen floor. In Toledo, a converted Muslim risks death by preserving poetry in Arabic script, concealed between sheets of blank parchment. These secret libraries were not grand halls of marble and oak. They were boxes, niches, crates, sacks, buried under soil. They were remembered in whispered instructions behind the loose stone, second tile from the corner, or marked with tiny signs, a carved crescent, a scratch in the wood, unnoticed by most. And the owners of these libraries knew discovery meant ruin. The Inquisition had inspectors of libraries, Jesuit priests, Dominican scholars, church officials, who went from town to town examining bookshelves. They were trained to look not just for titles, but marginalia, notes in the margins, private commentary, signs of unauthorized interpretation. Even having a legal Bible was dangerous if you had written too many personal notes inside it. In one case, recorded in 1594 in Lisbon, tells of a man arrested because his Bible contained a single line scribbled in the back: "God dwells not in cathedrals, but in the soul." The Inquisition deemed it a heretical claim. He was sentenced to public penance, and his library, nearly 40 volumes, was burned in the town square. But the ideas had already spread. You see, books were copied by hand in secret over long nights with trembling fingers and poor ink. In Florence, a noblewoman kept a servant who was a skilled calligrapher. While guests dined above, he copied pages of banned works below. It took months, but over time she built a collection. Plato, Ptolemy, the Kabbalah, all bound in plain brown covers to avoid suspicion. In Seville, a group of conversos who had converted to Christianity shared a single Hebrew prayer book. Each copied just a few pages at a time, so if caught, they could claim ignorance. But over years, they assembled full duplicates. These books were never seen in sunlight. And yet, despite all this risk, the forbidden books kept circulating. Why? Because some believed that truth could not be silenced. Others sought knowledge for healing, or wonder, or simple curiosity. And a few simply wanted to remember who they were. In the next part, we'll explore what happened when these secret libraries were found, how inquisitors interrogated book owners, how people were forced to burn their own libraries, and how, even in fire, words found a way to survive. When a secret library was found, it wasn't merely a matter of confiscation, it was a matter of identity. The Inquisition did not just search for books, it hunted the thoughts behind them. And when those thoughts were revealed in ink, pressed between leather or stitched into cloth, they became evidence, the most damning kind. In a dusty town in Castile, a young apprentice named Diego is brought before the tribunal. His crime? A Greek manuscript found in his teacher's quarters, a copy of Plato's Republic with notes in the margins. The teacher fled the town. Diego remained. Under questioning, he insists he never read it. But the inquisitor holds up the book. Whose handwriting is this? Diego hesitates. The lettering is his. He had copied part of the text for practice. He thought it safe, harmless, a lesson in calligraphy. Now, it's a link in a chain that could lead to torture. Across Spain, Portugal, and Italy, scenes like this unfolded again and again. A man questioned for owning a book of natural philosophy. A woman accused because she kept a Latin psalter beside her bed, written in a translation not sanctioned by the church. A boy imprisoned for copying a banned verse from a friend's notebook. The most chilling detail? Many of these books were not even heretical by intent. They were simply uncontrolled, unregulated, books that had bypassed the clerical gatekeepers and entered private hands. And the church feared nothing more than private interpretation. You see, in this era, the written word was meant to descend from the pulpit, not rise from the mind. A book could be permitted if read through the lens of orthot. Now we will look at how ordinary people were accused during the Inquisition, how suspicion crept into kitchens and bedrooms, how friendships unraveled, and how silence itself could become a crime. There is no knock on the door. Only the sound of boots on stone, hushed voices, and the sudden creak of iron as the door swings open. You don't have time to cry out. No one tells you why they've come. You're given no names, no faces, no documents. Only the black cloak of night and the hands of men trained to move without kindness. This is how it begins for so many, not with a shout or a scandal, but with a quiet arrest, made possible by someone else's whisper. And when the door closes behind you, your name is already being written into a book you will never be allowed to read. The Inquisition thrived not just on official doctrine, but on denunciation, the voluntary act of reporting a suspected heretic. It was a system built on fear, but one that disguised itself as faithful duty. During an Edict of Grace, the period following the arrival of inquisitors in a new town, every person was told to come forward and report others. This wasn't optional. If you didn't report a suspected heretic, you were guilty by omission. And so, neighbors turned in neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. Even children spoke against their parents, sometimes nudged, sometimes frightened, sometimes simply trying to protect themselves. The reasons for accusations were as varied as the people who made them. Sometimes it was jealousy. A merchant accuses his wealthier competitor of practicing Judaism in secret. Sometimes it was revenge. A woman accuses her former suitor of heresy after he marries another. Sometimes it was genuine belief. A devout parishioner hears someone question a sermon and reports it out of piety. And sometimes it was simply a way to survive. If your own faith was under suspicion, turning in others became a desperate lifeline, a way to prove your loyalty by offering someone else to the flame. The standard of evidence was low. You didn't need to prove that someone performed a heretical act. You only needed to suggest that they might have. Did your neighbor fast at strange times? Did they avoid pork or light candles on Friday night? Did they fail to attend Mass regularly? Did they whisper in a language you didn't recognize? Did they read books you couldn't understand? All of these were enough, not for a conviction, but for investigation. And once the Inquisition began to investigate you, your life changed forever. Let us imagine you are a shoemaker in Seville. You've lived in your neighborhood for 20 years, you were baptized as a child, you attend church when you can, and you confess when you're supposed to. But you come from a Jewish family. Your grandfather converted during the last wave of forced baptisms. You light candles sometimes, yes. Not out of tradition, but because your wife enjoys the smell of wax in the kitchen. You fasted during a sickness, not on a holy day. But someone notices, and someone reports you. The inquisitors arrive one night or one dawn, or perhaps while you're walking to market. They take you quietly, and no one stops them, because no one dares to interfere. To help you is to share your fate. Your friends do not visit your house the next day. They do not ask your wife what happened. They lower their eyes when she passes in the market, because to speak your name now is dangerous. The system of accusations was designed not to catch the guilty, but to maintain control. Even if most of the accused were eventually released, the process itself was enough to destroy them. Arrest meant public disgrace. Confiscation of property meant financial ruin. Prison, even for a few weeks, left physical and psychological scars. And a record in the Inquisition's book meant lifelong suspicion. Those who were accused often never knew who had turned them in. The Inquisition kept witness names secret, a practice it justified by saying it protected accusers from retaliation. But this secrecy made defense almost impossible. You could not confront your accuser. You could not challenge their statements. You could not even know what you were being accused of until days or weeks into your imprisonment. Some were clever. They guessed. They noticed which neighbor stopped speaking to them. They remembered a comment made in passing. They sensed who might have had reason. But even then, what could they do? Even for the innocent, words could trap you. Let us say you were brought in and questioned. The inquisitor asks, "Do you reject the teachings of the church?" "No," you say. "Of course not." "Then why did you not attend Mass on Sunday, April 5th? "I was sick." "You did not confess that illness. Why?" "I didn't think I had to." "Why did you not tell your neighbor you were ill?" Did you light candles that evening?" "Yes." "But." "Thank you, that will do." And just like that, a case is building. Even your stuttering, your fear. It can be read as guilt. You might try to be calm, but you're exhausted. You don't know what day it is. And the inquisitor seems so certain, so composed, so convinced that you are hiding something. Eventually you begin to doubt yourself. Those who were accused were placed in the Inquisition prison, a place apart from ordinary jails. They were not allowed to speak with other prisoners. They had no access to a lawyer. They had no visits from family. They were given minimal food, minimal comfort, and no timeline for their trial. Sometimes they were left there for months, even years, as their case was slowly built. And outside, life moved on. Neighbors married, children grew, businesses changed hands, but your name had vanished from conversation. It lived only in whispered prayers, or in the minds of those who feared they might be next. To be accused by the Inquisition was not just a legal matter. It was a social death, and sometimes even a spiritual one, because many who were arrested began to believe that God had turned away from them. They prayed in their cells, yes, but the silence after the prayers was louder than any answer. They tried to remember if they had sinned. Had they spoken a blasphemy without realizing it? Had they read a book they shouldn't have? Some confessed simply because they could not bear the waiting. Others invented sins to satisfy their interrogators. And in the most tragic cases, people turned themselves in, confessing to heresy just to avoid being accused by someone else later. The Inquisition encouraged this behavior. They called it cleansing. Better to confess early, they said. Better to face punishment now than eternal punishment later. And for many, it felt true. A public flogging, even a year in prison, was better than the stake. So they confessed, and the Inquisition recorded it all. Every word was copied into thick books bound in leather. Every name indexed. Every punishment catalogued. These books became the bureaucratic backbone of the Inquisition. And long after the flames of the auto da fe died down, those pages remained. They are studied even today, not just as records of persecution, but as portraits of ordinary life under extraordinary fear. For most people, being accused was enough to ruin a life, even if they were found innocent. Marriages fell apart, businesses failed, children were mocked in the street, and the accused lived forever with the label, a former suspect, a person of interest. Even when released, they were marked. Some were forced to wear special clothing. Some had fines to pay for years. Some were told never to speak of what happened inside. And so they kept quiet, and the silence spread. By the late 1500s, the Inquisition had refined the process to such precision that accusations could happen without any real contact. A single anonymous letter, unsigned, unverified, could launch a full investigation, and no one questioned it. Because to question the Inquisition was to risk becoming its next subject. And so people became careful. They avoided controversial topics. They smiled too often or not enough. They avoided reading or read only approved texts. They blessed themselves twice or not at all. Both could be dangerous. And at night, they prayed for forgetfulness, that the Inquisition would forget them, that their neighbors would forget them, that God would not test them. Because in this world, even a whisper could become a sentence. Now we will look at what happened once the accusation had been made. The knock on the door, the shadow in the hallway, the sudden descent into silence, questions, and cold stone, where night never truly ended, and the only light came from a flickering torch carried by someone you could not see. It rarely began with shouting. There was no storming of the gates, no flurry of swords or soldiers. In the world of the Inquisition, arrests were quiet, precise, and intentional, carried out most often in the deep hours of the night, when witnesses were scarce and resistance unlikely. It was not just about apprehending the body. It was about destabilizing the soul. To be arrested at dawn was frightening, but to be arrested in the dark, in the hour when the world slept, was something else entirely. Imagine the sound of boots in the alley. You are half asleep. The coals in the hearth have gone out. Your home is still, and then you hear it. A knock, not at your door, but at your neighbor's. Then another. A shuffling, something being dragged. You do not get up. You do not breathe too loudly. Because you know, tomorrow morning that house will be empty, and no one will speak of it. When the knock finally comes for you, it is not a question. It is a summons. A pair of armed men stand at your door. Behind them, a notary, and behind him, a hooded figure with a scroll, the authority of the Holy Office. They show no emotion. They ask your name. They tell you to come quietly. You may speak, you may protest, but it will change nothing. Because at the moment your name was written into the register, your fate was no longer your own. You are not beaten, not yet, but you are not treated as innocent. You are allowed to gather a cloak, a pair of shoes, perhaps a small item, a cross, a scarf, a ring, but not a goodbye. Your family is not told. Your neighbors will only find out when the sunlight rises over an empty home. The men escort you through narrow streets, avoiding lamps and crowded quarters. You are taken by alleys, servant routes, side gates, and by the time you see the iron-bound door of the Inquisition's chambers, your mind has already begun to fracture. Because silence is the first tool of interrogation. Inside, you are led not to a cell, but to a holding room. The walls are bare, the light is dim, the air is cold. There is no window. You are told to sit. You are told to wait. No one tells you how long. And when the door opens again, it is a different man who enters. He wears no armor. He carries no weapon. He walks slowly, calmly. He is not a soldier. He is an inquisitor. He does not shout. He offers a seat. He asks if you are comfortable. He pours a glass of water. And then, like a physician examining a wound, he begins to speak. Not of your crime, not of your soul, but of your thoughts. Tell me, he says, do you believe in the Holy Trinity? Yes. And in the virgin birth? Yes, of course. And in the teachings of the Church, that no other path leads to salvation? Yes. Then you are not a Jew? No. Not a Moor? No. Not a heretic? No, never. Then why did 3 separate witnesses report that you refused communion on the feast of St. Michael? I was sick that day. Then why were you seen walking in the square? And it goes on. Calmly, softly, the Inquisitor does not accuse. He suggests, he leads, he entraps. The goal is not to shout you down, it is to make you doubt yourself. Because if you begin to second-guess your words, your memory, your beliefs, then you are no longer defending yourself. You are unraveling, and that is where the Inquisition finds its leverage. The first interrogation often lasts hours. There are no clocks in the room, no windows to judge the passing of night. You are asked about your parents and your friends, what books you read, what foods you eat, what prayers you say, and when. Sometimes they ask you the same question multiple times. Sometimes they rephrase it slightly, waiting to see if your answer shifts. And if it does, they smile. Eventually they end the session. You are not told what will happen next. You are simply led away. The guards are not cruel, but they are not kind. They escort you to a cell, a narrow chamber with stone walls, a straw mattress, and a chamber pot. There is no candle. There is no blanket. There is no one to speak to. And there, you wait. For minutes, for hours, for days. You do not know which. Some prisoners scream. Others pray. Most simply fall silent. Because in that cold room, with no sense of time, your mind begins to betray you. You remember things that didn't happen. You forget things that did. You begin to wonder, did I say something wrong at the tavern? Did someone overhear me speaking Arabic in a prayer I learned as a child? You no longer know. And that uncertainty, that creeping dread, is precisely what the Inquisitors count on. When the second interrogation comes, it feels different. You are more tired, more compliant, more willing to agree. And so when they ask again whether you have ever doubted the church, you hesitate for just a moment. And that is all they need. Sometimes the interrogations are accompanied by documents, old records, anonymous letters, signatures you do not recognize. They read them aloud, slowly. They watch your face. You protest, they nod. You cry, they offer a cloth. If you confess, even slightly, they record every word. Some prisoners hold out. They deny everything. They remain calm, strong, faithful. These are the ones who eventually face torture, because the Inquisitors have another rule. A confession extracted through pain must be repeated freely afterward, or it is invalid. So the first step is always voluntary. The pain comes later, but for now you are given time to suffer, to imagine, to fold inward. They leave you in the cell for days, and then they return, and the questions begin again. By the time the third or fourth interrogation arrives, you may confess to things you never believed. You may invent heresies just to make the questions stop. You may name people you barely know, repeating rumors you overheard months ago, because the silence is worse than the punishment. And in the darkness of your cell, truth becomes irrelevant. Only the Inquisition's judgment remains. In some rare cases, the accused is innocent, coherent, and convincing. They are released, but they are never the same. They are watched, marked, whispered about. They walk the streets with lowered eyes. They sleep uneasily, and they never again speak their mind. But most prisoners are not released. They remain in the Inquisition's custody until the tribunal has reached a decision, weeks, months, sometimes years. And that decision is based not just on guilt, but on utility. Is your confession useful? Can it be used to justify other arrests? Does it serve the faith? If yes, you may be spared. If not, the fire waits. The midnight interrogation is more than a legal tool. It is a ritual. It breaks the rhythm of life. It replaces day and night with uncertainty. It replaces innocence with confusion. And slowly, It remakes the person who once stood at that door, reshaping them into someone who no longer knows how to speak freely or even to think. And still, you are only at the beginning, because the prison doors are still locked. The torches still flicker, and the tribunal has not yet spoken. Now we will descend deeper into the chambers beneath the tribunal halls, into the cells where time does not move and hope is not allowed to breathe. This is where the accused are kept before judgment, in places untouched by sunlight, where silence is not a gift, but a punishment. The Inquisition's prisons were not designed to punish the body. They were designed to unravel the mind. There were no chains on the walls in every cell, no fire pits, no shrieking torment in every hallway. But they didn't need to be hellish. They only needed to be quiet, dark, and indefinite. And in that silence, people would fall apart. Let us walk now through one of these prisons. The stone beneath our feet is worn, but still cold. The door behind us has no handle on the inside. The corridor ahead is narrow. The walls drip with moisture, mold creeps in the cracks, and the air is thick with the damp, sour scent of mildew and human breath. Trapped for days, weeks, sometimes years. There are no windows, no sky, no seasons. The light comes only from torches, carried occasionally by the guards. But their patrols are irregular. Sometimes a day passes before another shadow crosses your door. And in between, only darkness. Inside the cells, the conditions vary, but all share the same soul-crushing traits. The beds, if they exist, are bundles of straw. The covers are rough wool, soaked through from humidity and left unchanged for months. Some prisoners sleep on the floor, directly on the stone, where the cold seeps into their bones and never leaves. Rats crawl through the walls. Sometimes they are silent. Other times they nibble at your toes in the dark. There is a bucket in the corner that is your toilet. It is emptied when someone remembers, or not at all. The smell is unbearable within days, but after a week, you stop noticing. Your body becomes part of the prison's odor. Your breath, your sweat, your fear, they blend into the sour soup of rot that lives in the stones. The guards speak little. They open the door to bring stale bread and water no more than once or twice a day. The bread is hard, the water often smells like iron. They do not answer questions. They do not make eye contact. They move quickly, efficiently, and leave without a word. If you beg for news, they do not respond. If you scream, sometimes they return. Sometimes they don't. And then there is the isolation. You do not see other prisoners. You do not hear their names. Sometimes you hear coughs through the walls, or a whispered prayer, or sobbing late in the night. But even those sounds disappear eventually, because the Inquisition does not want you to feel companionship. They want you to feel forgotten. That is the first form of torture. Some cells are completely dark, no torchlight, no cracks in the door, no movement. Prisoners held in these conditions for weeks begin to hallucinate. They see lights that aren't there, but they hear footsteps no one else hears. Some begin to pray loudly, hoping to summon angels or saints. Others curl up, rocking gently, whispering names of people they barely remember. The darkness breaks them. It turns minutes into hours, and hours into days, and days into madness. There are stories, still preserved in tribunal records, of prisoners who confessed simply to escape the silence. They admitted to heresies they had never even imagined. They named others falsely, hoping someone might visit their cell again. They begged to be tortured, not because they wished pain, but because pain would at least be real. Then there is the waiting. This is perhaps the most inhumane part of all. You are told nothing. You are not given a trial date. You are not informed of what evidence has been collected. You are not told how long you will be held. You are simply kept. And every creak of a door down the hall, every footstep that echoes toward your cell becomes a moment of terror or hope. Will they take you today? Will they question you again? or will they forget you? Even the idea of being forgotten begins to feel like mercy. Some try to mark time. Scratches on the wall, prayers counted on fingernails, songs repeated each day, exactly at the same imagined hour. But eventually those rituals slip. You forget what day it is. You forget what season it was when you were taken. And worst of all, you begin to forget who you were. The mental toll is immense. Even those who enter with strong minds, educated scholars, devout priests, experienced monks, begin to unravel. They start to lose speech. Their vocabulary narrows. They become suspicious, even of themselves. Did I really say those words in the sermon? Was I trying to offend the church? Was my cousin truly loyal, or did I hear something once? The mind, once a defense, becomes a trap, and the walls echo only your own thoughts, until you no longer trust even those. Then there is the physical decay. Lack of movement, lack of food, lack of light. Prisoners grow gaunt, skin stretched tight against bones. Sores appear where bodies press against stone. Teeth loosen, hair falls out, limbs tremble with cold. Women sometimes fall ill from menstruation with no supplies or care. Men develop ulcers, fevers, infections, but medical treatment is rare. The Inquisition does not wish you dead, but they are not afraid of watching you suffer. A dead prisoner cannot confess. A broken one still can. And yet, in all of this, some prisoners hold on to hope, a vision, a voice, a remembered psalm. They whisper it each night, holding on to it like a thread in the dark. Some scribbled prayers into the straw with fingernails. Some sing softly, repeating hymns their mothers taught them as children. They do not sing to escape. They sing to remember that they once lived outside these walls, that there was a sky, a tree, a street with stones warmed by sunlight, a face that smiled at them once and meant it. But hope is dangerous, because if you hope too much, you begin to ask for answers. And when answers don't come, you despair more deeply than before. This is why some give up entirely. They lie down on the floor and stop eating. They stop speaking. They forget their own names. And in those rare cases, when someone does come, they no longer respond. They have become part of the prison itself. The Inquisition's system of incarceration was not merely about control. It was about transformation. They believed that remorse had to be earned, that a soul could not be saved unless it was first broken. So they built prisons that looked like tombs, cells that echoed like coffins, and routines that made time meaningless. And in doing so, they turned faith, once a refuge, into a cage. And all of this happens before the trial, before you know the evidence, before you meet the tribunal, before you are judged. You could spend months, even years, in these conditions without being found guilty of a single thing. And many did, because in the Inquisition's eyes, the appearance of guilt was as damning as guilt itself. And silence, even if it comes from innocence, is always suspicious. Now, we will enter the most terrifying chamber of all, where truth was not discovered, but extracted, where screams echoed through stone walls, and the soul was made to bend under the weight of faith twisted into punishment. This is the world of Inquisition torture, not to kill, but to confess. The Inquisition claimed not to be an engine of cruelty. Its leaders did not see themselves as executioners, but as shepherds. The tools they used, the pulleys, the cords, the racks, were in their eyes not instruments of violence, but of salvation. They believed that torture, when applied sparingly and methodically, could rescue a soul from eternal damnation. But the truth was darker, because beneath the robe of piety, the Inquisition carried a brutal knowledge that anyone, no matter how innocent, could be broken, and they knew exactly how to do it. Torture was not used immediately. It was held in reserve, a final weapon in the Inquisitor's arsenal. First came isolation, then the interrogations, then the slow erosion of identity. And only when a prisoner remained defiant, when no confession came, when no accusation against others was made, only then would the tribunal authorize torture. It required official permission. It was recorded meticulously, and it followed certain guidelines. But within those guidelines, the methods were devastating. Let us enter one of these chambers. It is small, bare, cold. The floor is stone, grooved by time. A drain sits in the center, for water, for blood, for filth. On the walls hang tools, not swords, not spears, but ropes, pulleys, iron collars, wedges of wood, pins, leather straps, devices designed not to maim, but to prolong suffering. Because the goal was not death, the goal was confession. The accused would be led into this room blindfolded, often trembling, often ill. They had heard stories. They had seen others disappear. And though no one ever returned to speak of it, the walls themselves whispered enough. The inquisitors did not do the torturing themselves. They employed official torturers, laymen trained in anatomy, in pressure points, in endurance limits. These men were paid not for cruelty, but for precision, because torture, in their eyes, was a science. There were several common methods, each terrifying in its own way. The strappado, this was perhaps the most widely used. The prisoners' hands were tied behind their back. Then a rope was attached to their wrists and thrown over a pulley in the ceiling. They were hoisted upward, sometimes until their shoulders dislocated. Then they were dropped suddenly, not to the floor, but arrested mid-fall. The jolt snapped joints, tore muscles, and filled the body with blinding pain. Sometimes weights were added to the ankles. Other times they were suspended mid-air for hours. It left no blood, but it left scars that never healed. A familiar image and a brutally effective one. The prisoner was laid flat on a wooden frame. Hands and feet were bound to rollers at either end, and slowly, deliberately, the rollers were turned. Ligaments stretched, muscles tore, joints cracked. It was not designed to kill, only to break resistance. Few lasted more than a few turns. In the water torture, this was subtler, but no less terrifying. The prisoner was tied down, a cloth placed over the nose and mouth, and water poured slowly, steadily, until suffocation set in. The sensation was not drowning. It was drowning without water. Panic set in within seconds. Confessions came swiftly, and yet this method left no visible marks, which made it, in the eyes of the tribunal, one of the cleaner tools of purification, the garrucha and the iron boot. Other methods varied by region and period. The garrucha was a variant of the strappado, but with added twists, such as tying weights to different limbs, creating imbalanced strain that tore the body from within. The iron boot was a metal casing applied to the leg, into which wedges were driven, slowly crushing the bones. Screams were common, unconsciousness frequent, and sometimes the prisoner died. Though the Inquisition claimed it never intended death, the line was fine. Each session of torture was limited, usually to 15 minutes at a time, but the tribunal could repeat the session if no confession was given, and many were tortured repeatedly over days. Confessions extracted under torture had to be repeated freely later, in a calm setting, to be considered valid. But this offered little protection, because by the time a prisoner was tortured, they had already been softened, mentally and physically, by weeks or months in prison. When asked to repeat their confession in court, most did, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of the knowledge that saying the wrong thing might return them to the ropes. But the Inquisition saw this as a triumph. To them, a confession was a victory for the Church, a soul saved, a danger neutralized. They did not gloat. They did not celebrate. They wrote it down. They moved on to the next case. And the prisoner, now broken, was left to await sentencing. Some confessions were genuine. Some were lies, spoken in agony, naming innocent people just to stop the pain. And others were fabrications the inquisitors themselves encouraged. Did you meet with the secret Jew? Yeah. Did he give you a scroll? Yes. Was it in Hebrew? I think so, yes. And did he say the church was false? Yes, I think he did. And so the record grew. More names, more accusations, more trials. Torture served not only as punishment, but as a source of intelligence. It helped the Inquisition build webs of suspicion. It turned the prison into an ecosystem of surveillance. Each prisoner became a potential informer, and trust, even within families, collapsed. Those who survived the torture were sometimes released, sometimes sent back to their cells, and sometimes sentenced by public penance, whipping, to exile, or, in the most severe cases, to death. But even those who avoided execution never escaped the trauma. They walked with limps, with twisted shoulders, with permanent pain in their hands or spine. Their minds, too, were marked. They feared the dark. They feared the sound of chains. They flinched when hearing prayers spoken too forcefully, because they had learned that faith, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. In the worst part, the Inquisition kept no images of their torture chambers. They did not boast. They did not paint. Their cruelty was bureaucratic. Their records are meticulous but bloodless. We know what they did only from testimony, from scars, from the echoes in letters and memoirs and whispered traditions passed down in families. The walls did not cry, but the people who left them never stopped. This is the legacy of torture in the Inquisition. Not only bodies broken, but truth itself distorted. Because once pain becomes the path to confession, truth has no meaning. Only obedience, only silence, only survival. Now we will look at the final act, the moment when judgment left the shadows and stepped into the light. The auto da fe, a day of holy theater when faith wore the mask of fire and the church staged its harshest message beneath the open sky. It was never called an execution. The Inquisition did not burn people. It reconciled them. It purified them. It delivered justice through the will of God. And to show that justice, to make it visible to the people, they built a ceremony around it, a ritual, a performance, a worry. This was the auto de fe of faith. Let us walk through a city preparing for one. The year is 1601. The city is Valladolid, but it could just as easily be Toledo, Seville, or Lisbon. Bells ring across the rooftops, not to mark the hour, but to summon the people. Word spreads. There will be an auto de fe tomorrow. Merchants close early. Artisans clean their tools. Children whisper excitedly. And the prisoners, locked in their cells for weeks, sometimes years, finally hear footsteps that do not pass them by. This is the moment they've waited for, or feared, or both. The plaza is cleaned. A great wooden stage is built, sometimes in front of a cathedral, sometimes in a town square. Officials inspect the scaffold. Carpenters drive the final nails. Soldiers practice their formations. The city has seen these before, but it never gets easier. On the morning of the auto da fe, the prisoners are awakened before dawn. They are dressed in special robes, zambenitos, tunics painted with symbols that show their crimes. Some are decorated with flames, devils, or snakes, some bear crosses, or stylized depictions of hell. The more severe the crime, the more elaborate the design. Those condemned to death wear conical hats, tall and crude, marked with black. Those who confessed and repented may receive mercy, a whipping, public humiliation, exile. But those who refused, who maintain their innocence, they walk with fire painted on their sleeves and flames awaiting them at noon. The prisoners are led in procession. They walk barefoot and shackled, flanked by guards and monks. Some weep, some chant, some stare silently at the ground, already halfway out of life. Behind them, nobles and city officials process in full finery, bishops in gold thread robes, judges in crimson, lords in silks. The church choir sings, trumpets blare, and the crowd, thousands strong, leans in from windows, rooftops, balconies, because this is not just punishment, it is public liturgy, theater of righteousness, and everyone must see it. At the front of the platform sits the tribunal, a semicircle of judges and inquisitors. They do not smile, they do not speak out of turn. Each prisoner is called forward. Their name is read, their crime is stated, their sentence is pronounced. Some weep as their fate is spoken, others remain silent. A few shout prayers not to God but to the crowd, begging them to remember this was not justice. The crowd murmurs, some cross themselves, others look away, but no one intervenes, because to challenge the sentence is to join it. The church performs a mass. A sermon follows, reminding the people that this punishment is mercy, that the flames are not for pain, but for cleansing. That error must be corrected not only in the mind, but in the body. The irony is unbearable, but it is not noticed, because for most, the spectacle is overwhelming. Now the condemned are divided. Those who confessed may be spared the stake, though not always. They may receive lashes. They may be paraded through the streets. They may be imprisoned for life. But those who refused, who clung to their truth or their silence, are handed over to the secular authorities. Because technically, the church does not kill. It delivers the body to the state, and the state obeys. A smaller procession begins. The condemned walk toward the execution grounds, usually just outside the city walls. The road is lined with watchers. Some cheer, some pray, some remain silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, unwilling to look. At the execution site, stakes are already prepared. Tall wooden posts, surrounded by bundles of kindling, ropes lie coiled beside them, firewood stacked, pitch poured, torches waiting, and the condemned are tied, sometimes upright, sometimes to ladders, tilted at an angle. Priests stand beside them, holding crucifixes, urging them to confess. Even now, and some do, in their final moments, they cry out, they beg forgiveness, they whisper prayers, and in those cases, the executioner grants a final mercy. A pouch of gunpowder, tied around the neck, lit before the flame reaches the body, a quicker death. But many receive no such mercy, because their crimes, in the eyes of the church, were too defiant. The torches are lit, the kindling catches quickly, smoke rises, screams pierce the air, and the crowd watches. Some cry, some turn away, others chant psalms with the clergy. The smell of burning flesh is unmistakable. It sticks to the nose, to the clothes, memory. It lingers long after the bodies are ash. Afterward, the ashes are scattered into rivers, into fields, sometimes buried in unconsecrated ground. Their names are written into ledgers, their crimes remembered, but no grave will mark them, no headstone, no prayers, only the silence of history. The auto de fe was not common. It happened perhaps once or twice a year in most cities, sometimes less. But its impact was immense, because the memory of it haunted everyone. People remembered the colors of the flames, and the words of the sermon, the look in the eyes of the condemned. And most of all, they remembered this, that these were not criminals, not thieves, not murderers. They were people who believed differently. And for that, they burned. The Inquisition always claimed that the auto de fe was necessary, that it strengthened faith, that it purified society, that it warned others, but it did more than that. It taught a generation to fear thought itself. the fear questions, the fear books, to fear even a moment of silence in prayer in case it was misunderstood. It taught people that belief must not only be felt, it must be performed. Perfectly, publicly, unquestionably. Or else. And the lesson remained long after the smoke cleared. Children learned to cross themselves properly. Servants learned to stay quiet. Scholars burned old manuscripts. Families changed names, changed customs, changed everything. And the church? It kept the ledgers and prepared for the next tribunal. Now we look away from the dungeons, the flames, and the chambers of torture, and instead turn toward the quiet corridors, the heavy tapestries, and the silent courtyards where something equally sinister lingered. The eyes of the Inquisition. The vorus is important. You see, during the height of the Inquisition, especially in 15th to 17th century Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, the greatest threat to your safety wasn't just a confession forced under duress or a trial rigged in advance. It was your neighbor, your brother, your servant, even your own child, because in the world of the Inquisition, everyone was listening, and anyone could be watching. The Inquisition's true power lay not in its instruments of torture or its bonfires, but in its network of informants, a latticework of suspicion so vast and so subtle that it reached into every corner of daily life. Let us begin in Seville, late 1400s. The streets are cobbled, the churches tall and cold. In this city, whispers carry through stone walls. In the alleys and in the chapels, the Holy Office has eyes. In every parish there is a man, not always a priest, not always a noble, but someone known as a familiar of the Inquisition. He wears no uniform, he carries no badge, but he is always listening. His job is not to preach or to judge, but to gather secrets. Perhaps he is a merchant, overhearing doubts about the Virgin's purity at a dinner party. Perhaps a widow, confessing that her neighbor fasts on the wrong days. Or a baker, who notices a customer never takes communion. Each detail is noted. Each suspicion quietly recorded. Each friendship potentially fatal. These familiars, often lay people recruited from the local population, were the foundation of the Inquisition surveillance state. They were everywhere, and no one ever knew how many there were. The number of informants in a typical city could reach into the hundreds. They did not act openly. Instead, they submitted anonymous accusations to the local tribunal, sometimes by letter, sometimes whispered to a Dominican friar under the seal of secrecy. These accusations were not lightly dismissed. A simple complaint that someone scoffed at relics or spoke against the saints could launch an investigation. And from that moment, the accused entered a world where nothing was private again. Even in prison, one was never alone. Inside the dark stone cells of Inquisition prisons, prisoners were deliberately placed with compañeros, fellow inmates who were in truth informants. These were sometimes fellow heretics looking to shorten their own sentence. Other times they were paid agents, trained to extract confessions through seemingly casual conversation. "Why are you here, brother?" they might ask. Or, "They say you denied the Trinity, did you mean to?" Every word spoken was later reported to inquisitors, who used the information to corner, manipulate, or further indict the accused. There was no safe space, not even within your own mind, for even dreams were sometimes confessed and recorded. But how did such a vast network operate? Let us peer behind the curtain. Each inquisitorial tribunal, say in Toledo, Valencia, or Lisbon, had a central registry. Here, clerks managed files on thousands of citizens, cross-referencing names, statements, and family ties. Accusations could come in from anyone, often with minimal proof, but once submitted, they triggered a silent process of scrutiny. The accused might be watched for weeks, their attendance at Mass monitored, their servants questioned, their garbage sifted through for signs of forbidden texts or non-Christian dietary practices. In Jewish convert communities, the conversos, even the act of bathing on Friday nights or not eating pork could mark you for suspicion. And as fear spread, families turned on one another. There are cases, painfully many, of children testifying against their parents, of wives denouncing husbands or slaves exposing masters, hoping for reward or simply survival. In one infamous example from 1494, a young woman in Zaragoza reported her own uncle for reciting prayers in Hebrew under his breath. She claimed he had once muttered something about Moses while slicing bread. That uncle was arrested, tortured, and burned. No evidence was too thin, no witness too young. The very concept of truth became warped. People began confessing preemptively. Better to admit error and ask forgiveness than to be found out later and face torture. Entire communities lived in constant anticipation of betrayal. Inquisition informants extended even beyond civilians. In monasteries, monks informed on each other, sometimes for petty rivalries, other times out of fanatical duty. In universities, professors whispered about colleagues with dangerous ideas. In royal courts, spies were embedded to monitor not only nobles, but also the influence of foreign thought, especially Protestantism. Always listening, and the Inquisition paid attention to every detail. In one case from 1571, a widow in Valencia was denounced by her maidservant for refusing to kiss a crucifix during illness. That servant received a certificate of piety, a document that helped her find more lucrative employment. In another case, a tailor was brought before the tribunal after a rival informed on him for sewing a tunic with Moorish patterns. Whether the design was truly unorthodox mattered little. The accusation itself created a record, and from that point forward, the tailor was watched. The fear of surveillance changed behavior across entire societies. People avoided private conversations. They stopped teaching their children folk songs or family customs. They burned old books, changed recipes, buried amulets, and altered funerary rites. The Inquisition's power was psychological, rooted not only in its punishments, but in the knowledge that it was always watching. It invaded friendships, silenced communities, and reshaped cultures. And the effect rippled outward. Diplomatic letters were intercepted and read, foreign travelers were watched and sometimes detained. Even printing presses were monitored, with inquisitorial censors reviewing every text for heretical content. Printers could be imprisoned simply for failing to remove a banned sentence, or for including the name of a scholar later deemed unorthodox. In places like Mexico City, the Inquisition crossed oceans, importing its system of suspicion into the New World. Indigenous communities were policed for idolatry. African slaves were watched for pagan remnants. Inquisitors trained local agents in the same methods of infiltration and betrayal used in Europe. No place remained untouched. Some informants were coerced into service, threatened with arrest unless they complied. Others were true believers, convinced they were saving souls. But many were simply survivors, trying to stay one step ahead of the fire. And in time, even the informants began to fear each other. The paranoia became recursive. The letters were unsigned. Whispers fell silent, and yet the shadow of surveillance remained. What made the Inquisition system so effective was its ambiguity. No one ever knew for sure who was watching. There were no posted guards, no flashing symbols, just the constant, invisible weight of eyes that might be there. People became their own informants. They practiced self-censorship to an extreme. They confessed things they hadn't done just to escape the uncertainty. Some begged for public punishment just to have closure, and long after a trial was over, even if a person was acquitted, their name remained recorded in inquisitorial files, marked forever by suspicion. These records were shared between tribunals, passed along with growing margins of annotations. Even in death, a person's reputation could be posthumously tried, their bones exhumed, their property confiscated, their descendants shamed. The surveillance did not stop at the grave. So, if you found yourself living in Spain in 1550, just one candle lit at your desk, a prayer muttered under your breath, a book open before you, how could you be sure no one was listening? You couldn't. Not in your home, not in your church, not in your prison, not in your mind, because in the time of the Inquisition, guilt was not proven. It was assumed, and survival meant constant silence. You never spoke out. You never asked questions. You watched your tongue. And still, it might not have been enough. Because the truth was this: the Inquisition didn't need to burn every heretic. It only needed you to believe they might, and to know that someone somewhere was. Now we will look at what happened after the sentence. For those who survived the cell, the whip, and the tribunal, life did not return to normal. Accusation was a mark that never faded, and in the quiet years that followed, the Inquisition's hand lingered in shadows, in gossip, in bloodlines. The flames had burned out. The public square was empty again, the scaffold taken down, the ropes swept away. But the people who lived through it, those who had stood in the crowd or sat in the tribunal or walked in procession wearing a painted robe, they did not forget. And neither did those who survived, because even if you were not executed, even if you confessed, repented, and were pardoned, the accusation stayed with you, not as a physical brand, but as something worse, a whisper in the bloodline. Let us walk now with one of them, a man named Mateo. He was a weaver once, arrested after someone reported he owned a book in Arabic script, a family keepsake, a grammar text from a Moorish ancestor. He spent 6 months in the Inquisition's prison. He was interrogated, not tortured. He confessed not to heresy, but to carelessness. He agreed to perform penance, pay a fine, and wear the San Benito, the robe of shame, in procession. An extended period of time elapsed before the judge a genuine verdict, and he was released, and he returned home. But home was no longer home. His shop had closed. His clients had moved on. His apprentice had left. Neighbors nodded politely, but did not linger. Children stared from alley corners. Old friends crossed the street when they saw him coming. His wife tried to help. She kept the house clean, the meals warm, the curtains drawn. But something had changed, not in the house, but in the air. The silence was thicker now, and every conversation felt like it might lead to another report. He no longer spoke freely. He stopped discussing theology, even in church. He gave up reading anything but official prayers. He burned the few letters he had saved from his father, written in a half-forgotten dialect, not because they were dangerous, but because he could no longer bear the sound of uncertainty. This was not uncommon. Thousands across Spain and Portugal, across the colonies of the Americas and North Africa, lived this way after being accused. Some were stripped of property, others were forced into exile, but most stayed and tried to resume ordinary life. But life no longer welcomed them, because the Inquisition maintained records. Once you were accused, even if found innocent, your name went into the books. And those records were shared with bishops, with employers, with local magistrates. When your child tried to marry, their betrothed's family might check the Inquisition archives. When you tried to join a guild, your past could bar you. Even if you had done nothing wrong, the fact that someone once believed you might have, that was enough. This created a new class of people, the suspected faithful. Not Jews, not Moors, not open heretics, but Christians who had been touched, even once, by the flame of suspicion. They were allowed to worship, to own homes, to participate in public life, but always with a lowered head, and always aware that at any moment the old accusation could rise again. Some changed their names. They moved to other towns. They took Latinized surnames. They burned baptismal records and remarried under false documents. And for a while it worked. But the Inquisition was thorough. Their archives were centralized, their memory long, their eyes ever open, and the fear passed down from parent to child. Don't speak of your grandmother, they whispered. Don't read aloud in Latin. Don't light candles too early. Don't answer the priest's questions too eagerly. Children were taught to smile and stay silent, to memorize answers. to cross themselves properly. Not too fast, not too slow, because a single mistake could cost everything. This fear shaped generations. It changed the way people prayed. Gone were the open devotions of old, the songs, the poems, the spontaneous expressions of gratitude or doubt. Now religion became rehearsed. Only the church's words were safe. Only the priest's script. Families stopped teaching older customs. They forgot ancestral tongues. They sold heirlooms. They erased stories from memory, because history was dangerous. And still, the stain remained. Even into the 1700s and beyond, families could be ruined by an accusation made decades earlier. In university admissions, in military commissions, in court appointments, purity of blood was a requirement. And purity meant no Jewish, Moorish, or heretical ancestry, not even rumored. The descendants of accused heretics were labeled as conversos, or new Christians, even generations after baptism. No matter how faithful, no matter how orthodox, they were never truly trusted. This stigma drove some families to desperation. They bribed notaries to alter records. They married cousins to avoid mixing into new suspicion. They tried to prove purity with forged family trees, going back to the Visigoths. But the stain was cultural, not just legal. It lived in gossip. And Goya says, in the way someone said your name, and in the way they paused after. Over time, the fear became habit. People began censoring themselves automatically. They avoided strangers. They destroyed books that weren't on the church's list. They refused to share dreams or visions or doubts, even with family. And thus, the Inquisition achieved its deepest goal. It made distrust a part of the culture, not through violence alone, but through memory. Some survivors of the Inquisition found new homes. Thousands fled to the Netherlands, to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire. There, they lived openly again, as Jews, as Protestants, as thinkers. But even then, the past clung to them. They changed their names. They spoke in code. They warned their children never to return, because they knew that survival is not the same as safety. And in Spain and Portugal and their colonies, the legacy remained. By the 18th century, the Inquisition's power had begun to wane. Its trials slowed. Its punishments softened. Its records became more bureaucratic than apocalyptic. But the fear, the culture it created, lingered. In hushed voices, in cautious glances, in the heavy silence between generations. Even after the Inquisition was officially abolished in the 1800s, families still refused to speak of it. They did not tell their children what had happened to their grandparents. They did not show them the documents. They left behind a vacuum, and the stories disappeared into the dust. But sometimes, in a drawer, an old San Benito was found, or a letter written in cipher, or a family crest no longer spoken of, and the questions would return, and the fear would flicker back to life, because some shadows do not fade easily. Now we turn away from the flames themselves, from the crowded squares, the rising smoke, the chants, and the crackling wood. We move to the quiet that follows, the silence of a home left empty, the eyes of a child whose father never returned, the footsteps of a widow walking through streets that suddenly feel colder. Because when the Inquisition was finished with the condemned, its shadow did not stop at the edge of the pyre. It reached backward and outward, into the houses, the kitchens, the fields, and wrapped itself around the families they left behind. In the Spain of the late 15th and 16th centuries, heresy was not just a personal sin. It was a stain upon a lineage. If your father was burned, you inherited the smoke. Let us begin in Toledo, a city once vibrant with diversity. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim families living side by side, though uneasily. Here, in a modest stone house, a woman named Isabel watches the fire from a distance. Her husband, once a notary, was accused of practicing Jewish rites in secret. Last week, he was arrested. 2 nights ago, he confessed, under torture. This morning he was burned. She remains untouched. For now. But only just. Already, the consequences begin to unfold. The first is social isolation. Isabel's neighbors, once friendly, now avoid eye contact. The baker down the road no longer greets her. The butcher speaks with hurried politeness but no warmth. People are careful not to be seen talking with her too long. After all, if her husband was a heretic, what might she be? And what of her children? Her eldest son, Matteo, once a clerk in training at the cathedral, is quietly dismissed. No explanation, no appeal. He returns home with ink-stained fingers and a blank face. His future, one of learning, service, perhaps even priesthood, has evaporated. In the eyes of the Holy Office, the family of a heretic is a threat. They may carry the same ideas, the same habits, the same blood. And so they are watched. Isabel begins to notice strangers passing the house too often. A man pretending to fix a cart lingers outside for hours. The local parish priest stops by unannounced, not to comfort, but to question. "Do you have any old books? Any relics your husband may have used?" he asks with a forced smile. She knows better than to say no. Then comes the second consequence, confiscation of property. Upon conviction, the belongings of a heretic house, land, tools, livestock were legally seized by the Inquisition, not just to punish, but to fund its operations. The Inquisition was not a poor institution. It grew wealthy, in part, by consuming the wealth of its victims. A tribunal clerk arrives at Isabel's door, flanked by 2 guards. They carry a list. One by one they take inventory. The copper pots, the wall crucifix, the family's only mattress. They are marked for seizure, even though Isabel herself has not been tried. She is allowed to keep only the clothes she wears and a few loaves of bread. The rest is claimed in the name of the Holy Office. This was not an exception, it was standard practice. The Inquisition's reach was not just spiritual, it was financial, bureaucratic, thorough. It bled its victims dry and then, like a parasite, bled those closest to them. And the worst wound, perhaps, was reputational. Inquisitorial records were public in certain ways, especially the auto da fe. When someone was condemned, their name was announced, sometimes painted on church walls. A family's shame was made communal property. Children of the condemned found it hard to marry. Employers refused to hire them. Even distant cousins were sometimes forced to prove their orthodoxy to escape suspicion. In some regions, people carried purity of blood certificates, known as limpieza de sangre. These were documents affirming that a person came from old Christian stock, untainted by Jewish, Muslim, or heretical lineage. Without one, opportunities vanished. And if your parent had been burned, even decades ago, you would likely never get one. The mark was indelible. Even conversion couldn't erase it. In fact, conversos, those who had converted from Judaism or Islam to Christianity, were often treated with more suspicion than those who had never believed at all. In Lisbon, in the mid-1500s, a boy named João tried to join the university. His father, a baptized Jew, had been arrested 10 years prior. Though João was a devout Christian, his application was denied. He would spend the rest of his life sweeping floors in the very college whose lectures he had once dreamed of attending. That was the quiet cruelty of the Inquisition. It did not just burn bodies. It extinguished futures. The pain was not just physical. It was generational, institutional, a flame that crept forward, burning everything it touched, even the unborn. But the worst came to those who dared to mourn. If you wept too openly for a condemned relative, if you questioned the verdict, if you dared say he was innocent, you might find yourself accused of sympathy, of complicity, of heresy by association. Isabel learns this when she visits her sister-in-law and is seen leaving a candle at the old family shrine. 2 days later, she is summoned to testify. Isabel's hands tremble as she steps into the tribunal's outer chamber. The room smells of candle wax and parchment. A Dominican friar greets her with a shallow nod. She is not on trial, yet. But the summons alone is a warning. They ask simple questions at first. Why did you visit your sister-in-law? Did you light a candle? Did you say anything in defense of your late husband? Each answer is written down by a scribe, every word recorded, like stones laid on a path whose destination she cannot see. Isabel answers carefully. She insists the candle was for Christ, that her husband's fate is not hers to judge. She is allowed to leave, but she knows she will not sleep soundly again. This is how the Inquisition's shadow worked, through suggestion, implication, fear. Families of the condemned learned to speak little, to walk quickly, to remain unseen. Survival depended on silence. But silence was not always enough. In some communities, the Inquisition required family members to publicly denounce the condemned, especially if they themselves had not been arrested. They might be forced to stand in church and declare that their own father, mother, or sibling had erred and was rightly punished. To refuse was to invite suspicion. To comply was to slice through the bonds of kinship with trembling lips. Children as young as 12 were made to speak against their parents. Some cried while doing it. Others stood mute, unable to perform the betrayal. And still, others resisted altogether. There are rare records of families who defied the tribunal, choosing exile over silence. They fled across borders, into France, the Ottoman Empire, the New World, carrying only what they could hide in sacks or memory. In Constantinople, some Sephardic Jews who had escaped the Spanish Inquisition rebuilt their lives. They preserved their language, Ladino, and their customs. But they did so with deep scars. Many never spoke of the relatives left behind. It was too painful, too dangerous. Others resisted more quietly. In remote villages, whispers of folk rituals persisted. Families kept secret objects, amulets, prayer books, heirlooms, hidden behind stones or beneath floorboards. Children were taught by candlelight to remember the old ways, even if only in fragments. But these were exceptions. For most, life after a family member's execution was one of diminishment. There were no reparations, no apologies, no return of seized land or coin. The church, in its eyes, had done its duty. The family, if innocent, had been spared. But in practice, they were never truly free again. In some cases, the shame clung for generations. Imagine, if you will, a girl named Clara in the year 1625. She is the granddaughter of a woman burned 50 years before. Clara's parents are devout Catholics. She herself has never known another way of life. But when she seeks to marry a nobleman's son, a genealogical inquiry is conducted, a routine matter among the upper classes. The investigation uncovers the record, her grandmother, burned for heresy. The marriage is quietly canceled. No one says why, but Clara knows. Everyone knows. And so she remains unmarried, not because of who she is, but because of what lingers in the blood. This is the hidden toll of the Inquisition, not the number of bodies burned, not the screams or the ash, but the silences that followed, the families that turned inward, the names that disappeared from records, the dreams that were not dreamed because fear left no room. And yet, in this devastation, there are also fragments of resilience. A woman in Valencia who, after her husband's death, raised her children as Catholics, but taught them stories of old Israel by weaving them into lullabies. A boy in Granada who found, beneath a cracked floor tile, a tiny scroll wrapped in oilskin. A family prayer, written in a trembling hand in a forgotten language. A man in Mexico City who traced his lineage back to a condemned converso and, instead of hiding it, wrote it into a book. These were not acts of rebellion. Not exactly. They were acts of memory. Quiet testaments that, even after the flames, some part of the soul could remain intact. But most stories are not remembered. Most families of the condemned disappeared into history like smoke. We know their names only from the margins of records. His wife, unnamed, 2 children sent to relatives. No further record. And so we ask, What happens after the fire? The body is gone, the crowd disperses, the priest folds his robe, but the echo remains, in the house that is now empty, in the name that no one dares say aloud, in the legacy passed down not through words, but through caution. If you lived then, Spain 1500, perhaps you wouldn't have been the heretic, but perhaps your brother would, or your father, or your wife, and then it wouldn't matter what you believed. The fire would find you anyway, not in the flesh, but in the shadow, in your home, in your name, in your children's future. And that, perhaps, was the Inquisition's cruelest triumph. It taught people not just to fear death, but to fear memory. Now we sail across the seas following the Inquisition not just through time but across continents, for its reach was not limited to Europe. Wherever the Catholic crown planted its flag, the Holy Office followed. And in the New World, the flames burned again, this time among unfamiliar languages, vast jungles, and a different kind of fear. The Inquisition, by the 16th century, was no longer just a Spanish or Portuguese institution. It had become imperial. As ships set sail for the Americas, for India, for Angola, and Macau, they carried more than silver and soldiers. They carried priests, and with them, the Inquisition's rules, its books, its rituals, because even new lands, with new peoples, new gods, and new skies, could not be exempt from the purification of souls. Let us begin in Mexico City, then called the capital of New Spain. By the early 1570s, the Inquisition had established a full tribunal there, complete with notaries, secret chambers, and its own prison. But unlike in Spain, the accused here were not always baptized from birth. Some were indigenous converts, others were black slaves brought from Africa. Still others were settlers, accused of blending native rituals with Christian faith. The Inquisition did not hesitate. Its goal was to enforce orthodoxy, and wherever doubt appeared, it was treated like a spark in a forest. In these colonial settings, the methods remained the same. The secret denunciations, the interrogations in Latin, the auto de fe, held in public plazas. But there was a new dimension, language and cultural barriers. Indigenous peoples brought before the tribunal often did not understand the questions or the accusation. What the church called heresy was sometimes just ceremony, a song to the wind, a dance at harvest, an offering to the mountain. But to the inquisitors, it was all paganism. And paganism had to be eradicated. In Peru, a Quechua-speaking shepherd was arrested for drawing symbols in the dirt, part of an old Incan prayer. He was whipped publicly, then forced to confess, and disappeared from the records. In Brazil, women were accused of witchcraft for using herbal medicines, practices passed down for centuries in African and Tupi tradition. The tribunal sentenced them to flogging, exile, or worse. These people had no legal training. They did not understand the concept of heresy, but they were still punished under it. And for Portuguese colonies like Goa, the reach was just as intense. There, the Inquisition set its sights on converted Hindus, Muslims, and Jews, anyone who might have retained ancestral customs. Hundreds were tried for keeping old wedding rituals, for fasting in the wrong month, for not crossing themselves properly. Even silence could be seen as evidence. A man who refused to speak during Mass out of shyness or language barrier was questioned and tortured, then labeled a heretic. The colonial Inquisition was different in scale, but not in spirit. Its prisons were smaller, its reach limited by geography, but its terror was just as potent, because those who lived under its watch felt cut off from defense. They were far from European courts, far from advocates, far from appeals. Once accused, they had few options. And for enslaved Africans, for indigenous converts, for Creoles born in the colonies, the burden was heavier, because they were never truly trusted. No matter how devout, no matter how obedient, they were always seen as suspect, and yet some resisted. In the highlands of Peru, secret altars were built to old gods, hidden in caves, lit by firelight. In the forests of Brazil were hilobolos, runaway slave communities, kept alive, African traditions, prayers, chants. These acts were not just cultural, they were defiant. To practice your own faith, quietly, secretly, in a world that punished it, was an act of courage. But it came with risk. Many were caught, and the Inquisition made examples of them. Auto da fe ceremonies were held in colonial capitals. In Lima, in Cartagena, in Salvador de Bahia, and Mexico City, the rituals unfolded in almost theatrical repetition. Prisoners dressed in painted robes. Crowds watching in awe and fear. Public floggings, sometimes burnings. The people watched, not just the colonists, but locals too. And the message was clear: there is one truth, and all others must kneel before it. But something else happened in the colonies. A new kind of spiritual blending emerged: syncretism. People found ways to merge their ancestral beliefs with Christian rituals. In Brazil, the Yoruba god Ogun became associated with Saint George. In Mexico, indigenous gods were hidden behind statues of Catholic saints. In India, some Hindu symbols were disguised in Marian devotion. These were acts of creativity, of survival. But if discovered, they were punished harshly, because to the Inquisition there could be no blending, only purity. And over time, the Inquisition's presence in the colonies began to strain. There were not enough officials. Distances were vast. Languages multiplied. And in some areas, local leaders began to resist its overreach. The governors protested. Merchants complained. Even bishops questioned its extremism. In some colonies, like the Philippines, the Inquisition never took full root. In others, it faded quietly in the 1700s, as Enlightenment ideas crept in. But for 2 full centuries, the colonial world had known the Inquisition, and it had known fear. One chilling example remains in Cartagena, Colombia. There, the Inquisition built a full palace, now a museum, where records show over 800 trials were held between 1610 and 1700. Most were for heresy. Some were for blasphemy, swearing aloud, mocking the church. Others were for bigamy, sorcery, or apostasy. The accused were locals, and most received public punishment. But the records also show that the fear went further. People stopped speaking openly. Wives denounced husbands. Children were taught to report neighbors. Even in the heat of the Caribbean, the shadow of the Inquisition felt cold. And so, the fire crossed the ocean. It took different shapes. It punished new faces, but it carried the same creed. That doubt was death. That difference was danger. That belief must be policed, not nurtured. Some colonial survivors, like their European counterparts, fled. They escaped to Protestant territories, to mountains, to islands. Some disguised themselves. Others created underground churches. But many simply lived in silence. And that silence echoes still. Though the Inquisition reigned most fiercely within Catholic realms, especially Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, its echo reached far beyond. In the broader stage of Europe, where kings watched kings and religions split like fractured mirrors, the Inquisition became more than a court. It became a symbol, a weapon, a warning. In Protestant lands, particularly England, the Dutch Republic, and parts of Germany, the Inquisition was cast as the very face of tyranny. To their writers and pamphleteers, it represented the dark heart of Catholic corruption, secretive, brutal, and unrepentant. English poets like John Foxe, in his Book of Martyrs, published lurid descriptions of Catholic cruelty, highlighting the torture chambers, the bonfires, and the gagged victims as evidence of Rome's moral bankruptcy. Woodcuts showed iron masks, thumb screws, and prisoners chained to dungeon walls, even when such devices were rare or fictional. Truth became secondary to propaganda. The Inquisition had become a useful monster, In the Dutch Republic, locked in a war of independence from Spain, the Spanish Inquisition was not just a foreign horror, it was a personal threat. Stories of autodefense, ritual public punishments, and secret informants were circulated to stir resistance. In paintings, inquisitors were often portrayed not as solemn priests, but as hooded executioners, cold and unfeeling. Even France, a Catholic nation, was uneasy with the extremes of the Spanish tribunal. Though France had its own persecutions, the French crown resisted the Inquisition's full autonomy within its borders. French kings feared what the Spanish monarchs had embraced, a church court that answered not to them, but to the papacy too walked a careful line. Rome had its own Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, established in 1542 to counter the growing tide of Protestantism. But compared to Spain's, it was often more procedural, more bureaucratic, and less violent. It focused more on books than bodies, and it was particularly active in the world of ideas, targeting astronomers like Giordano Bruno and Galileo Galilei for their writing. Still, the Pope could not publicly condemn the Spanish methods. Spain was the Catholic world's greatest political ally and its fiercest sword against heresy. But quietly, inside Vatican walls, there was discomfort. Some whispered that the Inquisition had gone too far, that the fear it spread risked alienating not just heretics, but the faithful. Across Europe, this anxiety over the Inquisition's reach gave rise to a new phenomenon: self-justifying intolerance. Protestant states had their own witch trials, their own censorship, and their own ways of purging dissent. But they pointed to Spain and said, "See, at least we're not like them." The irony was bitter. As the Inquisition became a symbol of cruelty, even those who copied its methods used it to excuse their own. By the late 1600s, the Enlightenment had begun its slow rise. Writers like Voltaire and Montesquieu would later mock the Inquisition, not just for its brutality, but for its absurdity. The idea that men could judge faith with fire, that truth required silence. Yet in the centuries before, the Inquisition cast a long and chilling shadow. For those outside its reach, it was something to fear. For those within, something to survive. And for all of Europe, something that mocked the age in blood and ash. Now we look toward the final chapter, not of punishment, but of silence. The Inquisition did not vanish in a blaze of shame or justice. It faded slowly behind curtains of politics, doubt, and changing winds. Yet its shadow remains, not in laws, but in memory, and in what we choose to forget. By the dawn of the 18th century, something was changing. The fire had not gone out, but it flickered. Europe, once ruled by absolutism and divine right, began to whisper new ideas. Ideas of reason, of individual conscience, of the human mind as sacred in its own right. This was the Enlightenment, and it did not come like a hammer, it came like a slow thaw. And for the Inquisition, that thaw was deadly. In Spain and Portugal, tribunals still operated, but their trials were no longer for witches or conversos. Now they targeted books, of philosophers, whispers of secularism, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke. Their works were banned, boggled, read by candlelight, and inquisitors, once feared as hunters of heretics, became censors, chasing paper instead of souls. Their power waned. By the mid-1700s, resistance to the Inquisition was no longer heresy, it was policy. Kings began to question its usefulness. Why allow a church tribunal to control trade, to arrest soldiers, to silence professors? In Portugal, the reformer Marquis of Pombal reduced its power dramatically after 1750. In Spain, royal edicts began to chip away at its authority, and in 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain, the Inquisition was formally abolished. For a brief moment, the Holy Office was no more. But like the heretics it once condemned, it returned. After Napoleon fell, the Spanish monarchy restored the Inquisition in 1814. Its final years were quieter, more political than spiritual. But it still operated. It still held trials, still burned books, still punished dissent, until 1834, when Queen Isabella II officially ended it for good. But the ending was quiet. There was no trial, no reckoning, no national confession. The archives were sealed, the record kept, and the memory dulled. In schools, the Inquisition became a footnote. In sermons, a taboo. In families, a wound left unnamed. Why? Because to remember it fully would be to ask what we allowed, what we believed, what we watched, what we whispered. And those questions are uncomfortable. And so silence settled again. Yet the legacy lives. In literature, we see it, from Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor to Borges's Haunted Librarians. In politics, we hear echoes when speech is censored, when dissent is punished, when fear is used to claim virtue. And in religion, we still wrestle with the line between conviction and coercion. Because the Inquisition was not about faith. It was about control of faith. And that struggle remains. The records of the Inquisition still exist. Millions of pages stored in archives in Madrid, Lisbon, Goa, Mexico City. They detail lives ruined, families divided, names erased. But they also show resilience. Of women who refused to name others. Of men who held to their beliefs in silence. Of communities who remembered their dead in secret. These are stories of courage as much as fear. And they matter because the Inquisition is not just history. It is a mirror. It asks us what we will do when belief is questioned, when fear rises, when law and faith blend too tightly. I think it asks, will we remember or will we stay silent? This is why the Inquisition still haunts us. Not because it exists, but because the impulse behind it to punish thought, to burn difference, to protect truth with violence still exists. In many places, in many forms. And it waits. So tonight, as we close this long, heavy story, remember, it is not fire that destroys freedom. It is fear, wrapped in robes, whispered in prayer, and followed in silence. And so we end our long journey through chambers of judgment, streets lined with silence, and prayers spoken through trembling lips. The Inquisition was not just an event. It was an era, a state of mind, a way of turning faith into obedience and fear into tradition. It taught the world how dangerous belief can become when it forgets compassion. It left behind not just ashes and records, but generations shaped by silence, by second guesses, by inherited fear. And tonight, we remember those voices, the ones lost, the ones whispered, the ones that never reached parchment but were passed in trembling lullabies, in coded rituals, in unspoken grief. Let them not be forgotten. Let us carry them softly into sleep, not as a nightmare, but as a lesson. Because history does not repeat exactly, but its shadows often walk beside us. And knowing them is the only light we have. Thank you, dear listener, for sharing your evening with me. If you found this story moving, please consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your encouragement helps me continue telling these quiet histories, the ones that matter most when the world is still. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time you usually fall asleep. I love hearing how far these stories travel. Until next time, keep a gentle heart, sleep peacefully, and never forget how powerful a quiet voice can be. Good night.